Time to debunk some misconceptions. Alright, today I want to debunk one of the most common concerns that I get from people surrounding the COVID vaccines. And that is, since these vaccines were approved in under a year, rather than the 10 years that we typically think about for them, that these things have been rushed through, and that means that we've skipped the science to make sure that they're going to be safe. Now, I'm not going to harp on the fact that the data shows that these vaccines are both safe and effective, or that we know that the vast majority of adverse effects happen within the first 6 weeks, and we have more than 32 weeks worth of data tracking these vaccines. That information's already out there and publicly available. Instead, we're going to focus on the vaccine/drug development process and why it really takes 10 years to go from discovery to the marketplace, or as we like to say, from the bench to your bedside. I can tell you this, it's not 10 years worth of research going on. More like a ton of time that's lost to paperwork, bureaucracy, and logistical planning. There are at least 3 major hurdles that can eat up time during the drug development process, and those are funding, recruitment, and review. First up is funding. Once you've discovered a new drug in the lab, it then has to go through 3 phases of human clinical trials to show that it's both safe and effective. And these trials aren't cheap. You have to pay every single step of the way. From the original investigational new drug application, just to move into human clinical trials, to the trials themselves, which can run anywhere from $1 million to more than $20 million per trial. On average, it costs about $1.3 billion to bring a drug to market. And since 9 out of 10 drugs fail to make it out of the R&D phase, and only about 1 in 1,000 drugs make it through the clinical trials, most investors aren't too keen to front the money to allow these drug companies to breeze through the phases. This means that companies may have to stop after each step of the process in order to reconvince investors that their product is still worth funding and to raise money to move on into the next step. And while fundraising may not be part of the science, it is still part of the timeline. So how are we able to skip all of these fundraising time sinks? Well, enter Operation Warp Speed. Regardless on how you feel towards the Trump administration, you gotta give credit where credit's due. They pumped in more than $10 billion into vaccine development to make sure these companies had all the money they needed so they could just focus on the research and keep the science moving forward. This meant no more time wasted spending months to years looking for investors to raise money to move on to the next steps. As soon as the science was ready, they could go on and proceed, cutting months to years off of the timeline by simply removing hurdle number 1, funding. Hurdle number 2, recruitment. So not only do these companies have to raise money for each phase of a clinical trial, but they can't even start these clinical trials until they have enough participants recruited to enter the study. Now, I don't know about you, but how many clinical trial recruitment opportunities have you heard of? And if you have, how many of them actually apply to a condition you may have or even care about? For me, the answer is, off the top of my head, none. And especially none that I can think of going like, wow, this drug is super important, I can't wait to sign up for. Even though I know there are tons of new clinical trials and drug studies that are going on every single year, they're not often touted across our news stations and public media. But that wasn't the case for these vaccines. Everybody knew about COVID. Everybody knew about the race towards a vaccine. So unlike other vaccines that can get held up for months to years trying to recruit enough eligible participants for just one study, when the call for volunteers came out for these vaccines, there wasn't a shortage of people willing to sign up. We had plenty of people across all demographics and all locations that were ready to jump right into our phase trials. Furthermore, unlike other vaccine studies for viruses like West Nile virus or St. Louis encephalitis virus, which may only infect a handful of people each year, making it really tough to know whether or not your vaccine's actually working, or if the people in your study just weren't exposed to the virus. The coronavirus, on the other hand, is infecting a lot of people, like 6 million plus people, which makes it really easy and really fast to see whether or not your vaccine's actually working. So not only did we save time by not having to wait around for months to years trying to recruit enough participants to fill each and every clinical trial, but we also save time by having a virus that's so infectious that allows us to find out if our vaccines are working rather quickly. Hurdle number 2, recruitment, and establishing effectiveness, solved. Lastly, we have hurdle number 3, review. Shots fired at all my government workers out there. But the FDA is a governmental institution, no different than when you think about the DMV. What I mean by this is that while they're always busy, they also never seem pressed for time. So anytime a company submits something to them for review, it can take months just to hear back. Case in point, remember that investigational new drug application we talked about? That application you have to submit just to get approval to do a phase 1 clinical trial? Well, the way that application works is that you submit it to the FDA, and then you have to wait 30 days to hear whether or not they're going to reject you. And if they don't reject you after 30 days, then you're cleared to go ahead. That's right. They don't have to say that, hey, 10 days later, you're good to go. They just let you sit on the line for 30 days before you can even move ahead with your first phase 1 clinical trial. Then even after all that time spent waiting, after all those years of fundraising and recruitment and data analysis, once these companies finally have all of their clinical trials done and they're ready to submit to the FDA, they can spend almost a year just waiting around for the FDA to review their application. That's right. Under the FDA's standard track of review, their goal is to review a company's application within 10 months of its submission. That's 10 months these companies spend just sitting around waiting to hear back. Just think, in the 10 months that we've known about the coronavirus here in the United States, it's already infected more than 16 million people and caused over 300,000 deaths. Could you imagine if we had to wait another 10 months just to find out if one of these vaccines had been approved? Luckily for us, the FDA has 4 other tracks of approval, specifically designed to cut down on this time and accelerate the review process in times of need. These are priority review, accelerated approval, breakthrough therapy, and, wait for it, fast track. That's right. Turns out fast track isn't just some term that we hear on the news, meaning that the science has been skipped and all these things are being pushed through willy-nilly. It turns out that fast track is actually an FDA-regulated review process meant to expedite the review of drugs that are addressing an unmet need. In this case, an unmet need being a global pandemic virus that has caused the deaths of hundreds of thousands and continues to infect millions. We might want to make that a priority. And that's exactly what the fast track review process does. It gives these companies priority access to the FDA, meaning that they have a direct line of communication to make sure that they're doing everything they need to keep these drugs moving along. On top of that, it also gives these companies access to something known as rolling review, which allows the companies to continuously give their data to the FDA for review instead of having to wait around for 6 to 10 months to hear back on their application. So all in all it really means when a drug is approved for the fast track is that the FDA is going to be more involved, which is good, and that the FDA actually has to do their job in a timely manner and review the application as soon as possible, rather than the standard 10-month wait. So you see, no science is skipped. These drugs still have to meet the same standards, they still have to provide the same data, and they still have to show that they're both safe and effective before the FDA will review them and even think about signing off on them. So in review, one of the major reasons that modern day vaccines take so long to be approved, at least along the standard track, has little to do with the actual science, and a lot to do with the logistical and bureaucratic barriers they have to overcome. Alright, well, hopefully you found this helpful. As you can see, I'm exhausted. It's like 2:40 in the morning. Yeah, I don't know. Reach out, feel free to ask any questions if you have any other questions. Otherwise, signing off still feels weird. We're all friends here, so I don't know. Good night.